Documents found in a leather suitcase recovered from the wreck site of RMS Titanic revealed that the suitcase belonged to a man named Howard Irwin, yet no one named Howard Irwin is listed on the passenger manifest. Then there are the school books of Edgar Samuel Andrew and the chilling statement he wrote in a letter to his friend. Right now, I wish Titanic were lying at the bottom of the sea. All this on Titanic, Stories from the Deep. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered 3,800 meters deep in the Atlantic Ocean. Over 5,500 artifacts and personal items have since been recovered, all reminders of the passengers and crew who set sail that fateful day. These objects tell very real stories of love, survival, mystery, and fate. This is Titanic, Stories from the Deep.
I think Titanic is a special story and unique because it touched the world. And as the accident and the sinking unfolded, the world was being told about it at the same time.
Marconi's wireless telegraph was relatively new. Ships were now able to communicate with shore. This allowed the news of Titanic's sinking to travel quicker than ever before.
So it's a horrible story. It's a heroic story. It is one that resonated in everybody's minds.
Why is Titanic special? I think that there are several factors here. Number one is you have a ship that has been touted as practically unsinkable for all intents and purposes, sinking on its maiden voyage. You have the almost archetypal idea of hubris in that they were sailing into a known ice field and they had received warnings and proceeded and catastrophe befell them. And I think it's very easy for us to imagine ourselves in those circumstances and to ask ourselves, what would we do? The clock is ticking. Some of us are going to live. Most of us are going to die. What do you do when faced with this situation?
In 1993, a collection of items from a single suitcase was recovered from the debris field surrounding RMS Titanic. There were letters and postcards, a diary, tools, sheet music, and musical instruments. Documents that were incredibly preserved inside a leather case clearly revealed the owner's identity as a young man named Howard Irwin.
The thing about suitcases is, if you're lucky, they contain a name, and you will know who that person was, and it now puts all these objects into context. When a suitcase is recovered, there's a lot of excitement. Because most cases are made out of leather, that leather contains high amounts of tannin, and the tannin permeates the interior, and this is what allows you to conserve books, papers, letters, postcards. So as soon as it's opened up, you immediately take everything out according to what it is. Is it paper? Is it clothing? Is it metal? Is it a ceramic? You throw it in a catalog, and then all the items are separated, and they begin their conservation regime. And you've got to resist the urge to just open up a book or something like that. It has to go in to conservation absolutely untouched.
All of these intriguing artifacts were carefully conserved and identified by internationally renowned Titanic experts and are stored in this top-secret warehouse here in Atlanta.
For instance, there's the Howard Irwin suitcase. This was full of all kinds of small objects that would be meaningless if they were just found on the bottom of the ocean.
Thanks to the conservation of these objects, Titanic researchers were able to come up with a good picture of who Howard Irwin was.
It was recovered as a suitcase at the bottom of the ocean. However, upon recovery, the leather and probably cardboard of the suitcase collapsed. So all we have are the things that were packed inside of the suitcase. Howard Irwin had been traveling around the world for a couple of years with his good friend Henry Soutall. And they had been across America, they had been to Australia, Bora Bora, Africa, and back to England. Inside the case were musical instruments, lots of sheet music from popular tunes as well as classical tunes, and postcards, letters, belts, because they were trimmers, leather trimmers.
Now, if we just found these tools on the seabed, it would just be tools. But because he was an upholsterer, he specialized in the upholstery of horseless carriages and wagons. All of a sudden, they're just not tools. We now recognize them as leatherworking tools.
So all these things give you a good example of the person who's represented by those items in the trunk. And I would say that Howard Irwin was pretty much a bon vivant. Yeah. I would say that he had a more exciting personality than his counterpart Henry, but they got along well, and they worked well together.
A 1997 television special featuring artifacts recovered from the Titanic wreck site included some of these postcards found in Howard Irwin's suitcase. This sparked the beginning of one woman's exciting discovery of her family's unexpected and mysterious connection to Titanic.
We're sitting there in our home on a Sunday afternoon, and they were talking about the artifacts that they had recovered, and they're showing a letter on screen. And when they got down to the end of it, it was signed Mrs. Shuttle. And I kind of almost fell over because it's not a very common name. And then I noticed that at the very bottom of the letter, there was a little blurb that said, "Roy sends best wishes." Well, Roy was my ex-husband's grandfather's name. And Pearl, who was also mentioned in the letter, was his great aunt. So I'm sitting there thinking, what is going on? How did this letter get on Titanic? Well, someone finally said, you need to talk to RMS Titanic Incorporated. They're the sovereign possession of the wreck.
Barb eventually makes contact with the man in charge of the artifacts from the recovery expedition.
We found out in that phone conversation that for the year of 1910, Howard had kept a diary that told how he and his friend Henry had left Buffalo to travel across the country and ultimately around the world and then return on Titanic. But before they left, Pearl and Howard met when he was 19 and Pearl Shuttle was 17, and they fell in love. So they were trying to keep this love affair alive. The majority of the letters that were ultimately found were from Pearl.
Pearl Shuttle was a member of a band, and so Pearl would travel with her band and perform throughout the Midwest. And so we have Pearl writing to Howard and saying where she was, that she missed him, why can't he write? Or she would send little postcards that say, you know, you should write me. She's very passionate about him, so obviously there was a strong love interest there.
Most of her letters were trying to convince him of her love for him. And the very last letter was basically a 7-page letter from Pearl. And the bottom line was, if you don't trust me, then we're done, and we're not going to write anymore.
Barb and her husband ask family members about Pearl and are told that she died in 1927. But it's not known if Pearl and Howard ever reunited or why he wasn't on Titanic.
We know that he's traveling with his friend, Henry Soutall. So we looked up the passenger list, and lo and behold, we found Henry Soutall listed. But no Howard, so we had no idea.
The alphabetical passenger list did not contain the name Howard Irwin. A young Irish woman was also in love at this time. Bertha Mulvihill had left her homeland and immigrated to America a few years earlier. She then came back to Ireland in late 1911 for a surprise visit with her family.
There was 11 in the family. There was 12 altogether. One of them died young. We're standing on the roadway where Bridget's family house, where she was born and reared.
The original Mulvihill home is over 200 years old and has been modified for use as a stable on the family farm.
You can picture the house that the roof was hatched the whole way along. There was 3 rooms. So you had all the boys, all the girls, Mammy and Daddy, and the old woman all in the house. Don't ask me where to put the beds. They were a close family. Even to this day, we all hear about the whole family and what they done and what they did, and you kind of look up to them. They were a real tight, close-knit group of people all together.
Despite having their own farm, the Mulvihills suffered during and after the Great Famine, like much of Ireland.
So during the famine, there was enough food in the country to feed the country, but it was all exported by the landlords on the ships to England, and they let us here in Ireland, they left us to die. Well, they were emigrating for a better life. Here, you couldn't get anywhere, really. You just survived. Where somewhere else, you could get on and have a good life if you worked hard. And that's why a lot of them went to America.
Bertha Mulvihill, there's a whole story about her. She was about 26 years old and had been living in the United States since, I believe, 1906. Ended up working in the Rumford Chemical Works, which is where she met her future husband, a man named Henry Noon. When she was there, courtship was different than nowadays, but Henry Noon, he had actually bought her several items as an engagement gift. She had a bracelet, a cross, and then she also had an engraved watch. That was a very generous gift to kind of note the occasion. Yeah. And something that's kind of funny is that she liked to pull surprises on people. So in 1911, after she got engaged, she snuck back to Ireland. She bought a ticket on the Lusitania across the Atlantic, didn't tell anybody she was coming, rented this jaunting cart, and came riding back into town, hooping and hollering, yelling that she was back. She had this like larger-than-life persona and really did like pulling surprises like that.
This is all well over 100 years ago now. But yes, her mother and father must have been overwhelmed when she came back. And she knew in her heart and soul the chances of ever seeing Ireland or her mother and father again just wasn't going to happen. That had to be so hard. How you actually dealt with it in your mind and your head, you know, that was difficult.
The greatest loss of life in the Titanic tragedy was amongst third-class passengers. Some survivors reported that third-class passengers were kept from getting up to the lifeboat deck. But even if there was equal access for all, there was only enough space for slightly more than half of the people on board. Did third-class passenger Bertha Mulvihill survive? The class system was very much alive and well at the end of the late Edwardian era in 1912. There was a great divide between the wealthy and the poor. This was reflected in the cost of a ticket for passage on Titanic, which ranged immensely. A first-class ticket could go for up to $870 or £85,000 in today's currency for one of 2 parlor suites featuring their own promenade decks, while the third-class ticket averaged £7, equal to about £681 today.
I'd say most definitely that the class system did exist on Titanic. In first class, we have the Jacobean and Louis Quatorze and all this splendour. And then we go down a modified, slightly more simplified version in second class. It's still some interesting public spaces. And then, of course, we get into the rather utilitarian third class, where the rivets are exposed. Instead of luxurious wallpapers, we're seeing whitewashed walls. But of course, it was still very much a ship that had multiple purposes. It was not just to cater to businessmen who were accustomed to travelling the North Atlantic and might do so many times. You had, of course, the immigrant trade at the other end, where people were moving to seek the new life in America.
When she went to Ireland to visit her family, Bertha Mulvihill had left her fiancé, Henry Noon, back in America.
Her sister Kitty was going to be married in Ireland, and while she had trepidations about leaving him right before their wedding, she really was homesick. So she took the trip.
And she's there for the fall and through the winter. And at this point, my grandfather's really missing her and wondering if she's gonna come back because, you know, it's been a while. And then she really misses him. So one day she was walking through the town of Athlone, and she saw a poster and it said, "The Titanic Maiden Voyage." And she thought to herself, you know what, I think I can take that trip and surprise Henry. So they had to leave from Queenstown, Ireland. Her berth, where she stayed, it's like a little tiny room, and it had bunk beds in it.
While first and second class passengers paid a great deal more for their tickets, it was the large number of third class passengers that were the bread and butter for the White Star Line. And those passengers were well fed on board Titanic.
The food in third class, I think, is really important to understand. It was 3 square meals a day. And oftentimes, the people traveling third class hadn't necessarily had that. They were, many of them, farmers. But these were 3 square meals a day with very hearty food like stews or plum pudding, and lots of it. And that was one of the ways they wanted to build their reputation. And they would provide them with postcards that said, "Oh, the food was great. Here's the ship I was on. It's wonderful."
This chef's hat, recovered and conserved by EMG, was owned by one of the many young men who prepared the abundant food on board Titanic.
This hat was recovered from a suitcase, and there were a few odds and ends in it, nothing really very big or identifiable. When this was conserved, we discovered that it was a baker's hat, and it belonged to third-class baker Hine, and he wrote his name in ink on it. So it's very small. You can just see it there. As a baker, he would have made daily breads, he would have made desserts, possibly plum pudding, all of those things that were part of every single meal. He was originally from London, but had relocated to Southampton and signed on as perhaps one of his first jobs on a ship.
Tragically, Titanic would be William Hine's last job at sea. He and his brother-in-law, who was a fellow crew member, both perished. Their bodies were never recovered. After reading transcripts of the love letters Pearl Shuttle wrote to Howard Irwin, Barb Shuttle is eager to find out more about who they were and what became of them. She also wants to see if she can solve the mystery of how his suitcase got onto the ship without him.
So we decided we were all going to do everything we could to try to figure out what happened. One of the first things was for us to go to Buffalo because we knew that was where Howard and his friend Henry left from. We spent a couple of hours in the Buffalo Library looking through microfiche upon microfiche upon microfiche. Well, what we found was in the Buffalo Inquirer of April 16th, 1912, they actually said that Howard had come home 2 months earlier. And we're thinking, okay, well, that would explain that he wasn't on Titanic. But again, we didn't know how true that was or what the situation was.
Or why his suitcase was on Titanic.
We decided we would look in the city directory records and see what we could find. And we found Howard. So we knew he had come back to Buffalo. We didn't know when, we didn't know why, we didn't know how. We were just still baffled.
Barb keeps pursuing the mystery and decides to visit Pearl's hometown to see what clues she can find.
Next day, we went up to Hamilton, Ontario, which is where the letter had been written from, and we knew that the family was buried there. So we went to the cemetery, but we couldn't find Pearl anywhere. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, I found her. There had been just like a little indentation in the ground, and there was Pearl's gravestone. Well, first of all, surprised. We thought she had died in 27, and when we found out it was 1911, it kind of opened all kinds of new possibilities as to what had happened with Howard and Henry. You know, we thought, gosh, if she passed away, maybe he came home to spend time with the family. We didn't know, because at that time, we didn't know what happened to Howard.
On the night of the collision, Bertha Mulvihill was in her third-class berth in the lower levels of the ship.
She was in bed, sound asleep. It was such a jar that she almost fell off the bed, and she knew something was really wrong.
So she pinned the pocket watch inside of her coat. She had her bracelet on that Henry had given her as an engagement present. And she also had her cross and chain on, which was another gift from Henry. Everyone was rushing for the staircase, but someone pushed her backwards and said, no, you can't come up, and she fell and she thinks had broken ribs.
It's quite conceivable she reached the top of a staircase and somebody denied her access, and it might be for any number of reasons. That staircase may have led up into a galley or a blind alley. You can't come in here is not necessarily, we forbid you from coming in because you're third class. It's because there's no exit from this section.
I think for those passengers in that part of the ship, there was a panic because they heard the noise of the collision. They could see water coming into the ship. So they knew it wasn't something minor. They knew there was something serious, even if they didn't know the ship was really going to sink. I think there was a little bit more of a sense of urgency and even like a little bit of panic than there would have been for people that were in different areas of the ship.
At approximately midnight on April 14th, 1912, Captain Smith gives the order to start loading lifeboats. In this age of chivalry, it's women and children first.
Women and children first at the time, it was certainly touted as, one of the great traditions of the sea. But the unfortunate fact is, if you look at a statistical breakdown of shipwrecks up till about that time, women and children fared very badly in shipwrecks for obvious reasons. Women wear restricted garments. They weren't accustomed to any strenuous athletic endeavour. Children, of course, are extremely vulnerable in a shipwreck. So when a ship goes down, they are often completely at the mercy of the elements, the crew, whether or not they're put in a lifeboat. And it resulted in, statistically, up to the point of the Titanic, your survival chances in either group were very low.
It was pandemonium. People were like pushing and shoving. But there was a sailor that she had met like in the beginning of the Titanic venture, and he really liked her. She was a real pretty girl, and he would come up and sweet talk her. So when they were like trying to get out, she saw that sailor and she said, please help us. And so he knew a way of getting out. So he took her and they went through some passage that they were able to get to the top deck.
She told us about climbing up bolts and cleats.
Which is like a term for a ladder of some kind, which I believe might have been the crew ladder that was leading from A deck up to the top deck.
You have the captain who's on the bridge. Then you have other officers going around performing vital duties. And I think that third class wasn't so much forgotten about. I think the stewards are down there waiting. When do we get word to pass third class up? And that word never came. And so when third class was saved, a lot of times it was through their own personal initiative.
When she arrived on the top of the Titanic deck, it was awash in ice. And she knew at that point it was probably going to go down. And she took off her shoes. She stood up on a railing that was the height of a 3-story building. And in her stocking feet, she jumped off the railing.
In April 2000, another suitcase was recovered from the debris field of Titanic. Again, many personal items and documents were well preserved inside the leather case. Expert conservators and Titanic researchers here at EMG were able to identify and learn a great deal about the suitcase's owner.
When we're able to identify objects that belong to a specific passenger, it's usually because the objects have been recovered from inside a leather suitcase or a bag, which protected those items. And in most cases, people wrote their name on things, so it's really exciting.
Most of our books came from a 17-year-old passenger named Edgar Samuel Andrew.
He had his school books, he had letters from his mother, so that was pretty easy to trace.
Edgar Andrew was the son of British expatriates who were living in Argentina. He was born in 1895. He had travelled back to England for his education. He was studying in Bournemouth.
The fact that we have the paper is wonderful. The fact that we still can read the writing is a different factor.
We can see that the printing is still there. It's an English grammar book.
The inks are probably oak gall inks at that point, and so they're very permanent. so they don't wash off like the ink that we use today. And then they also wrote a lot in pencil, and the pencil seems to be retained within the surface of the paper as well.
So you still have staining and the molding. You can see here part of an envelope that was stuck to the top of it. So he had just basically dumped all these things into his suitcase and had finished school, and he was headed out to have fun.
I think the collection of items we have from Edgar Andrew are very interesting and show into his character a little bit. We have another area in another notebook where he is practicing writing his name. I distinctly remember doing that as a teenager. How shall I write it? Shall I write it with a forward slant, with, a more fancy hand? We also have a pair of
Formal opera shoes. They look rather feminine.
They're more like a woman's ballet shoe with a grosgrain bow on it. But they were for men and formal occasions where you wouldn't want to wear a boot. And so he had a pair of those, and they were bought at a store in Bournemouth, and the streets, of course, are still the same, so we can identify the store where he bought them, which is kind of fun to do.
He was one of the passengers that was originally booked on the Oceanic, and he was quite disappointed when his sailing plans were disrupted by the coal strike and he had to transfer to the Titanic. It actually meant that he had to leave a week earlier, and he'd been looking forward to meeting a close friend by the name of Josie Cowan, and this meant that the meeting could not take place.
So he boarded the ship, and he sent a famous note.
You figure, Josie, I had to leave on the 17th this month aboard the Oceanic, but due to the coal strike, that steamer cannot depart. So I have to go 1 week earlier on board the Titanic. It really seems unbelievable I have to leave a few days before your arrival, but there's no help for it. I've got to go. You figure, Josie, I'm boarding the greatest steamship in the world, but I don't really feel proud of it at all. Right now, I wish the Titanic were lying at the bottom of the ocean.
Researching these artifacts that belong to people allow me to look into their lives, a little bit into what kind of person they were. He was young, but at 17, you were considered a man of the world as well. He had to go on Titanic instead of his original schedule, and so he missed Josie, and he lost his life.
As far as we know, Edgar Andrew's body was never recovered, or if it was recovered, it has never been identified. Barb Shuttle's journey of uncovering the mystery of what happened between Howard Irwin and Pearl Shuttle came to a conclusion when she made contact with Howard's nephew in Canada. The nephew shared Howard's handwritten memoirs with her. From these, Barb finally learns why Howard wasn't on Titanic.
The night before Titanic sails, April 9th, 1912, Howard decides he's going to go out for a walk and clear his head. As he's walking through the streets of Southampton, he meets up with 10 students from St. Louis. Well, they had spent time in St. Louis, so this was like, kind of a homecoming for him. And they all went to a pub. While they're in the pub, a bar fight breaks out. Howard gets whacked on the head and wakes up the next morning on a tramp steamer bound for the Orient. He's been shanghaied. So here's poor Henry at the dock with all of Howard's things, because he figures Howard's a trustworthy person. He said he was coming. He's going to be here. And Howard never shows up. So Henry gets on the ship with all of Howard's things. And then ultimately, 5 days later, Titanic sinks, and Henry, at 25 years old, loses his life. So we finally figured out who Henry was, and it was just an amazing experience. And that's, I think, when the importance of the artifacts themselves hit us, because without them, had they not brought up this trunk, we wouldn't have known any of this. He's a real person now. He's not just a name on a page. And that's when I think it really hit us. Hang on, I'm sorry. I get emotional, I really do. Sorry. The tramp steamer that Howard was on eventually makes it to Egypt, and that's where he hears what happened to Titanic. And he makes his way back to England, finds out that Harry didn't make it, comes back to the United States. Now he's lost his friend, his best friend. I'm sure at this point, he knows he's lost Pearl. He's lost all of his possessions. He's lost everything. It's got to be devastating to this poor man.
It's a pretty wild tale. Can we believe it? Howard's hometown newspaper reported he'd returned to America 2 months before Titanic set sail, leaving his true whereabouts a mystery to researchers.
Do you know, I can only tell you what I've heard. He did not embark on Titanic. Now, I have read he was shanghaied, which I find kind of hard to believe. I can't tell you anything beyond that other than he was not on board the ship.
But if he had returned 2 months earlier, why was his suitcase on Titanic?
So the story is that Henry was carrying Howard's trunk with him. So it was just a friendly gesture, and that's it.
Sometimes mysteries don't get solved. What we do know is that Howard and Pearl loved each other. Pearl died in 1911, and Henry Soutall perished in the sinking of Titanic. Those who did survive were saved because they made it into a lifeboat. They were the lucky ones, especially considering there were not enough lifeboats on board for all passengers and crew.
The question of lifeboats is one that has become a very strong part of the Titanic mythos because, of course, we know that there were only lifeboats for approximately half on board under the best of circumstances. But in fact, the Titanic, under Board of Trade regulations, was oversupplied with lifeboats.
When the ship was approved for sale, the White Star Line had placed on board as many lifeboats as were required by law. Initially, the designer had placed quite a few more lifeboats on board, but then the company started looking at everything and saying, well, there isn't enough place on board now with all these lifeboats for people to promenade or do games or, it was too cluttered. So the designer was requested to remove lifeboats down to the level that was only required by law because they never really thought that the lifeboats would be used to save lives. They thought it was merely something to remove a few people if there was an engine problem or something of that nature. They never anticipated that it would be a full-blown saving of lives in the middle of the ocean, and these are the only boats you have. They never thought it would be that.
Third-class passenger Bertha Mulvihill, desperate to survive, fought tooth and nail to make her way up to the lifeboat deck.
By the time they got to the top deck, almost all the lifeboats were gone. And then there was one last lifeboat. It was number 15. And so it was starting to be lowered down. And so the sailor said, now, if you want to survive, you got to jump. So she kicked her shoes off and she jumped from the top deck down into the boat. And then everybody started jumping on top of her. So like landing on top of her. She was in like so much pain.
Bertha Mulvihill was already injured. She had injured her ribs and back when she was pushed down those stairs, but this guy landed right on top of her and further injured her, so can't even imagine.
After that experience, she was adrift in the boat, and of course everyone was afraid of being sucked under by the Titanic as it went down, so the oarsmen were rowing as quickly as they could to get away from the ship. And she remembered the lighted portholes going below the waterline and still being lit.
So when my grandmother was in the lifeboat, she said that she saw the Titanic split in half. Everyone, all the way up to 1997, they all thought it just sunk. But she said, I saw it split in half. And she said that she saw people, drowning around her. And there was one young woman who had a brother. The brother was down in the water, and the oarsman took the oar and smashed his face until he sunk under the water. And the woman's trying to pull her brother up into the boat. So it must have just been incredible.
And Lifeboat 15 was one of the most heavily loaded boats. And the edge of the boat was pretty low down towards the water. She was in so much pain and agony from these injuries that she had. She was hanging over the side of the boat. Her hair was actually dangling in the water because she was feeling ill. And she says that it got so cold by morning that her hair had frozen with ice in it.
She spent the evening in a hallucinatory way. She thought icebergs were chasing after her. She saw many horrifying things that night. She was forever scarred by her experience.
Bertha Mulvihill had made it off Titanic and into a lifeboat, but she was suffering greatly, both physically and mentally.
She was at the very edge of the boat hanging in the water. And so she's like, must have been just awful because she had broken ribs and just cold and hungry, and they don't know what's gonna happen to her. And she like said a prayer to the Blessed Mother, and she said, you know, if I survive, I'm gonna name my firstborn Mary. And then early in the morning, she sees green lights on the horizon through the fog. And she says, what's that? To some of the men. It's a rescue ship.
When Carpathia came up in the morning and started taking the survivors out of the lifeboats, Bertha was so weak that she couldn't even climb up the rope ladder. So they looped this rope around her and lifted her up to the gangway. She had injured ribs and back. You can imagine how agonizing that would have been, but she was just incapable of doing it herself.
They came into New York, and she had no idea what was going to happen at that point. But by fate, my grandfather had seen the Providence Journal with a headline, "Survivor of the Titanic being Miss Bertha." So he went and he was walking around, and suddenly they were right next to one another. And my grandmother came up from behind, and she put her hands over his eyes and said, "Guess who?" And they just, you know, that was it. She said, "Take me home." They got on the train, they went back to Providence, and she was able to rally to get married and have a lovely August wedding. But the initial weeks and months afterwards, I think, was a combination of being somewhat shocked. They would call it post-traumatic stress syndrome today. But she was able to have children after the wedding.
Bertha did keep the promise she prayed while on board the lifeboat and named her first child Mary.
And that was my Aunt Mary, who was born in 1914.
She died when she was 73. So I knew her for 12 years before that, and I think she mellowed out. She really suddenly was willing to talk about it, and I think it had a lot to do with the grandchildren. She loved her grandchildren, and I think this was her first coming out as a survivor.
She was one of the lucky ones that came out of the third class and was able to get to the top deck, because like almost a good third of them, I think, all died. They never got out.
This is one of the tragedies, of course. If it had been organised, if they had been mustered in time, if they had time to do it, they could have saved all the women and children and a substantial number of men besides.
She had her very own opinions about the Titanic. She would always say the same thing. I saw the real story, and it wasn't pretty. It was a very nasty, ugly story.
Boarding Titanic, Bertha had engagement gifts given to her by her fiancé, Henry Noon. The stories of Titanic's sinking that Bertha told her grandchildren always included their favorite story about the fate of these 4 precious gifts.
My grandfather Noon gave this pocket watch to my grandmother as an engagement gift, along with a gold bracelet and a neck chain with a cross. It's something that was on the Titanic with Bertha Mulvihill. It's something that we treasure. The watch itself is gold, as the other 2 objects. And we're very proud to own these and to have them in our possession. And we're proud to share them with you today.
It's always amazing when you tell someone that your grandmother was on the Titanic, they'll say, well, did she survive? And I'll always say, well, if she didn't, I wouldn't be here.
Barb Shuttle is at EMG's top secret warehouse in Atlanta to get a first-hand look at some precious and never-before-seen letters written to Howard Irwin by Pearl Shuttle.
Barb,
Hi.
thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You ready for this?
I think so.
Okay, I'll help you through it. Don't worry, it's gonna be fine.
Okay.
Barb, meet Alex.
Hi, Barb. I'm
Good to
so
meet you.
happy to meet you.
Really?
It's really wonderful to have you here. So I decided to bring out some things for you to see. These are some of the letters that I know Pearl sent to Howard Irwin because they were recovered from his suitcase. And you can see the water stamp from how it was left in the water.
That's fascinating.
These were mostly posted in the U.S., but he kept them with him. That's the key point.
Yeah.
This one, you can see it's very faded, but it was from the Esmond Hotel, and it's in Duluth, Minnesota, because she traveled throughout the Midwest with her band.
Playing her cornet.
Basically, she said, I had your letter, and I ran down. I didn't even take my costume off. I just sat on the seat, ripped it open, and read it. And this is part of a 9-page reply to him.
She was crazy about it.
These are really important because they were sent more frequently than the full letters. And they're just little postcards to remind him that she's here. To my Valentine, just the way the bumblebee loves the honeydew, on the sweetest, fairest flower, that's how I love you, your Slats. And I'm thinking Slats was a slang name for something, because she talked in slang. When you read these letters, a little racy, maybe. It says, hello, Squidgens. See?
Okay.
Hello, Squidgens, ha ha. Still waiting for a letter.
Oh my God. Okay. Now I'm getting emotional.
Well, that's nice.
It's just,
Great to have this.
you know, it's
Yeah.
it's really emotional. It really is. Just amazing.
Thanks to the recovery and conservation of these artifacts from the Titanic debris field, we know far more about Titanic and those who once sailed on her than we would have otherwise known. Some artifacts reveal answers to long-ago mysteries. Others just create more questions. In this way, Titanic's journey continues. And with every recovered artifact, our connection to this tragedy deepens, and the memories of those who perished on that cold April night live on.